So Pauline, you can start.
Yeah, sorry, my internet is a bit unstable, so I hope I will manage to stay in the meeting during all this meeting. So Valerie, it's the floor is up to you. So thank you.
Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation, and to the organizer. It's always a pleasure to be back in the ISP family, as we like to call it. So now today, Jisoo asked me to talk about the role of journalism in fighting misinformation, how a tech company, journalists, and fact checkers deployed digital technologies to fight misinformation. And what do everyday uses of technology tell us about the form of knowledge claims that of these institutions? You know, are these epistemologies of knowledge claims different? And if not, what can be done about this? These are also some of the questions that are part of a grant that I'm part of, and actually one of the one of the grant participant is here, Bente. So at the end, if you have any question, they could also be directed to her. And this grant is titled Source Criticism and Mediated Disinformation Scam, to be more succinct. So in November, we started to conduct interview with journalists, fact checker, tech and platform companies around the globe because we wanted to learn more about their thought about misinformation, how they were fighting it, what were the challenges that they were encountering, and what sort of collaboration that they had across these companies. And today, because as you know now, we're still conducting interviews. I'm going to present a collection of cheeky thoughts from a sociology of work perspective. More specifically, we want to argue that misinformation, to reduce misinformation, key institutions need to recognize that they're part of a larger ecosystem, a theme that was discussed actually in the last panel by Lisa and Ethan. And institutions must work in concert with one another and have shared goal. And as we know from the literature, any such coordination may run counter to the economic incentives of major companies and upstarts. And research show that it's often difficult to do that kind of collaboration across industries and sectors. But here's what we've learned so far from our limited amount of interviews. So first, there are civic and democratic gatekeeping approach. These mean that there's not one single epistemological approach to counter misinformation. So at the beginning of the 2020 US campaign, Twitter, as you all know, marked misleading information, and then they changed their strategic orientation, right? It did so by hiding fewer false or misleading posts to contextual fact checks, such as by linking to the source of information. This example confirms how platform companies have become the arbiter of truths, while news organization and fact-checking companies are seeking to regain that gatekeeping power that they may have lost from these big tech and civic-owned companies. This particular arbitration of what is true, we think, shows stark contrast with what journalism have sought to achieve, right? Journalists have been described as civic gatekeeper, which means that they have civic and moral role in journalistic institution, and they are enacting them in cultural code that give shapes to and protect society normative values. And on the other end, you have platform companies that have taken the role of gatekeeper of democracy, which is a role that was traditionally taken by formal political actors through formal political channels. For example, Twitter expanding its definition of hateful content to ban language that dehumanizes people on the basis of race, ethnicity, or national origin. These two forms of gatekeeping show that there's a well-known detachment between media tech and platform company, and the latter especially have been demonstrably been developing policies in the fly, which becomes even more complicated for journalism trying to reclaim this gatekeeping power. So second, the assessment of misinformation is intertwined with professional identity, and I think this codependent isn't addressed much when we're talking about misinformation. The research suggests that while publisher and platform companies are competitors for attention, engagement, and revenue, there is this form of codependence between them when it comes to combating misinformation. So in interviews, fact checker prided themselves on being transparent by showing, as you know, steps that they have taken to come to their conclusion. But journalists are applying a different approach where they do have to uphold to certain values and epistemological presumptions, such as keeping sources anonymous, thus rejecting a fact-checking approach. In turn, organizational constraints are key to understanding what we call today the misinformation disorder. Organizations have their own interests, their mission, they depend on time, resource, capabilities, and these affect the choices that they make. So fact checkers that we talked to emphasize how effective fact checking relied on local understanding. Media organization told us that they decided to develop their database only in a particular local because that's the only place that they could uphold the privacy laws, while other locals, it would have taken more resources for them. Other are complaining about the challenge of their lack of financial resources to invest in software. Journalists also share the sentiment that they have to fight for those who agree with them. This is an idea that is supported by research, but they also wish that they could convince those who have different opinion, but acknowledge the reality and the challenge that they face. So there's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and all these challenges are not unique to misinformation. One could argue that this is a fundamental component of the information economy. So what would we like to know going forward? So first, these fragmented practices based on mission, interests, and capability underscore a larger issue, a larger sociological issue. How can truth and trust, which is very related to truth making, gain legitimacy if institutions are fragmented and if there's limited coordination among institutional actors? Second, tech solutionism is not the ultimate way to fix the problem. Rather, it exacerbates the issue. So to what extent platforms contribute to this problem and damage journalism? And finally, what kind of misinformation is worth fighting for in journalism? That's the theme that is recurring over and over in our interviews and a challenge that journalists and fact checkers are encountering. And what processes might be implemented in news organizations to make these efforts more significant? So if this sounds like this is an assault on the First Amendment, take a deep breath. It is just a reflection on the fact that different institutions within the media ecosystem can act collaboratively in a way that respects freedom of speech and encourages a wide range of voices to be heard and centers debate, hopefully within the realm of reality. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. So now thank you very much, Valerie. Now the floor is to Jonas.
Thank you, Pauline, and thank you, Valerie, because if you already were worried that this might get the, what she talked about might be an attack on the First Amendment, I will talk about in a similar context. First of all, of course, thank you for having me, for the invitation, for organizing this great workshop, which is really, as we all know, very relevant right now. Well, Valerie was more talking about in the context of journalism. I will focus more on strategy and policy in particular. And more to the point, I will talk about recommendation algorithms, recommender systems. And for that, let me just go a little back. In 2019, some colleagues of mine and I were doing a project together with the New York Times on YouTube's role in Brazil. And for doing that, we kind of like used our standard tools of collecting algorithms and recommendations to figure out, like what are the communities that YouTube kind of like recommends together. One finding in that context was that we stumbled over an international community of channels as well as videos that featured partially clothed children. And I think the New York Times then called this a digital playground for pedophiles. All of these videos were in themselves legal and innocent. Together, the algorithm kind of like had pushed them in a community that seemed to be targeted and optimized on the viewing habits of pedophiles, however, which just like, is an extreme example of highlighting how recommendation algorithms can cause real life harm. So today I kind of like want to make a brief provocation on what I think is wrong with recommendation algorithms and how to fix those. This is obviously kind of like based in what a lot of, on the work that a lot of you have been doing, as well as kind of like what my colleagues and I have been doing on YouTube in particular. For example, like looking on the far right in Germany and the US over the last 5 years, the work we've been doing on Zika in Brazil, and of course, the work we're doing right now with regards to election misinformation in 2020 in the US. In general, I want to kind of like touch upon 3 points that I think need to be considered when talking about recommendation algorithms. The first one is, how do those work? What are they in particular, actually? The second is, can recommendation algorithms be good to begin with? And finally, I will talk about something that I'll call a goal disagreement. And you will probably all be way too familiar with this to begin with. So how do recommendation algorithms work? In general, and most of you will know this, they are based around machine learning. And consequently, are what we would consider statistical probability models. Now, we kind of like use them a lot in our own research when we do quantitative methods. And we all know boxes, prominent sentence, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Now, this is important because this just highlights that recommendation algorithms will never be perfect to begin with, no matter how much we put in, because there are always approximations and there will always be shortcomings. We know this from work that others have been doing in the computer science field, as well as in sociology and media. Safia Noble, for example, highlighted the role of algorithms in reproducing racism and gender stereotypes. In our own work on YouTube in particular, we saw that recommendation algorithms are really good in detecting similar content. They are, however, at the same time, really bad at understanding nuance. What I mean by that is, especially if we look in the context of politics, was that when we looked at the political communities, far-right extremist channels were lumped together with more moderate conservative channels, creating pathways from moderate to extreme with one click. And that was a pattern that we've seen in Germany, in the US, as well as in Brazil. So they are great, right? But really bad at understanding nuance. And this is kind of like just an example of how these algorithms work, right? They are good in detecting like similar content, but then have obviously shortcomings. The second point is, can recommendation algorithms be good to begin with? And I would argue that here there are like 4 overarching issues at play. First and foremost, algorithms are black boxes, right? We don't know what's going into them. We don't know what is being prioritized. And we don't know how the output, like what the output realistically is. Neither do the people that are exposed to them, right? We think about these issues for a living. And even we kind of like, have some idea of what's going in, but often are mystified. People that use those consistently will often not even think about kind of like that these results can be personalized, nor that, like their own habits confirms kind of like what they are getting recommended. In some instances, the algorithm even has like this character of a deity, right? And if you think about kind of like how content creators on TikTok or YouTube talk about the algorithms, because they're dependent on its basically grace, because if they're getting recommended, their channels and content grows. If they don't, they will stay unsuccessful. However, we know that algorithms and recommendation algorithms are often trained on one thing: engagement. Now we know from years of communication studies, for example, what drives engagement, what drives people to write comments. And the one thing that we know here is its negativity. It's scandalization, it's controversy. So what algorithms in this context do and are trained upon is not kind of like good aspects. It's really people disagreeing with each other and getting riled up. The third point then is that recommenders cannot not recommend, right? This is kind of like a play on Václavic, of course. And what I mean by that is what Golubitsky and Boyd called data voids, right? That there are voids in content and what algorithms kind of like serve as, which can be abused on the one hand, but on the other, that no matter what recommendation algorithms do and no matter how you curate it, they will always have to recommend something. Now, in our own work, we obviously, and I talked about this, we showed that there is no nuance, meaning that in the same communities in which you will find legitimate health information, you will also find illegitimate health disinformation or political opinions and far-right extremist talk, right? And in addition, again, recommendation algorithms are personalized. And while, for example, we found in Brazil that YouTube curated the search results around Zika, we also found that in the recommendations, while the first few results were always good and legitimate, the long tail was full of misinformation, meaning that this recommendation algorithm that has to recommend will serve as eventually misinformation and problematic content because it is on the platform. This is especially so if, for example, how we showed in the US and in Germany, if radical content is much more popular on that platform because it's not available elsewhere. Finally, the goal disagreement, and that is really just that what's the motive of companies when they optimize their algorithms. Again, I talked about that this has to do with people keeping people on the platforms. And the goal for that is, of course, money, right? Now, this is a goal disagreement because if we talk about political content and what's the reason, for example, for journalism, then we talk about the democratic good, right? We talk about because they create a public sphere. Algorithms don't do that. Algorithms are not there for the public good, not there for the public sphere. They're there to make people money, meaning that there's a goal difference between what we would consider good and what companies would consider good. Yet we kind of accept that these recommendation algorithms are just there, right? We don't necessarily question even their existence to begin with. Which brings them kind of to the question of its effects. Like we know little about recommendation algorithms' effects. We kind of know these anecdotes of radicalization, but we don't have real patterns of radicalization, right? And I would posit that this is also rare. What I would argue is twofold. In our study that Adrian Rauchfleisch and I did on YouTube's and user comments was where we kind of followed 100 channels in the German far right over 2 years or so. And we kind of looked whether there was a trend. And indeed, we found that the users started to comment more and more on other channels as well. So the community grew more central over time. And we would argue that they kind of this is an indicator that they formed a shared identity, that they became aware of the other channels that were out there. In this context, a topic that we discovered that was integral for this community and this growth of the community were the refugees, right? Now, we don't, of course, know whether that is all for the algorithm. Especially Becca Lewis's work highlights how these influencers also have each other on the channels and, co-feature each other. But we would also argue that the recommendation algorithms have an impact here. More generally, we would argue that recommendation algorithms create some form of digital Thomas theorem, meaning that it doesn't mean, that people are getting radicalized. What we argue is that these recommendation algorithms normalize radical views and misinformation, right? You don't have to believe them, you don't even have to watch them, but if you see them consistently in your recommendations, you'll kind of perceive them as that those are legit views, right? And not the fringe views that they are. And to kind of sum this up, I think in the EU as well as in the US, there's a lot of discussion going on basically getting more transparency into these black boxes. My argument would be that this is the wrong starting point, right? Because it assumes that these are just there and they are legitimately, they have a purpose there. I would argue that we should kind of at least in academia, should look at those from a democracy theory and public sphere theory to kind of figure out what's the purpose, what can they actually do for the public sphere, right? Twitter is talking about the health of the public sphere, but that's about it. And yeah, sure, most content is harmless on YouTube and others, right? But as we showed kind of in the context of the New York, in our analysis with the New York Times, even potentially harmless content can turn out to be very harmful in this context when it comes to recommending videos of children, right? And when the New York Times actually contacted YouTube, they did one thing immediately. They shut down its recommendation algorithms around that for videos that had children in them. And the question I want to kind of leave you with is, why don't we do the same thing for politics?
Thank you so much, Jonas. So now the floor is to David.
All right, thanks. Thanks for the invite. Great to be here and cool to hear the things that other people are talking about. So what I have spent a good chunk of time thinking about is, what platforms can do to reduce the spread of misinformation, and also some of the impacts of misinformation. And just one thing that I wanted to start with of why I think this is really an important problem is sort of along the line of what Jonas was saying. Even just being exposed to a headline, just reading it, you don't have to read the whole article, just reading the headline increases subsequent belief, even for totally crazy seeming headlines. This is a very long established cognitive science result. So it is problematic when people are getting exposed to content. And also if we have some data suggesting that even if actually totally false or banana stories are pretty infrequent, occasionally seeing them or knowing them that they're out there also shifts your perceptions of more plausible but false stories and makes those things seem more true. It kind of anchors your understanding of craziness and be like, well, okay, Pizzagate probably didn't happen, but the emails, that seems kind of reasonable after you've been thinking about Pizzagate. So anyways, the question is, what can platforms do about it? And the dominant approach from the platforms so far, in my understanding, is that fundamentally they're tech companies, and so they go for a tech solution of creating classifiers. We use machine learning and natural processing. We'll just figure out what misinformation is, and then we're all set because we'll just know what it is, and we can downrank it or flag it or whatever. And that's obviously not. I think that is a good thing to have in the toolkit, but that's very far from a complete solution because, among other things, like truth is hard to define. It's not like a binary clear concept. It's much more of a graded thing of sort of how misleading is this, and so it's hard to create good training sets. Plus, it's non-stationary in the sense that, like, yesterday's misinformation, it doesn't necessarily have the same characteristics of tomorrow's misinformation. So if you train the models on old data, which is what you have to do, it's not necessarily going to perform well in the future. And I think COVID misinformation is a good example of that, where that sort of came out of left field in some sense. So we want some kind of human in the loop, and the main way that platforms have been doing that is using partnering with professional fact checkers, as we've heard about today. And I actually think that is overall promising, in the sense that I think that the general consensus is, if you label something as false or as misleading, it makes people believe it less and it makes people share it less. And I don't think really need to worry about like backfire effects where warnings make people dig in. Early fears about that have been like pretty well debunked. But the problem with fact checking, with professional fact checking, is it's not scalable. That is, it takes way longer to do a detailed fact check of something and write up a little summary of it than it does to create false content. And so most stuff never winds up getting checked, and even the stuff that does eventually get flagged or downranked while it's in its sort of peak virality spreading period, it's not going to be labeled. And so I think that's the real challenge for professional fact checking, is scalability. And so what we have been working on is trying to think about what are approaches that social media platforms can add to their misinformation toolkit that don't have this scalability problem. And there's two things that we've focused on and that we think are promising. The first one is, it sort of comes out of some more basic cognitive science research on why people share misinformation in the first place. And we have a lot of data at this point that suggests that just because somebody shares something doesn't mean that they necessarily believe it. Like when we started doing research here, we just naively assumed that sharing was a kind of behavioral measure of belief. But if you separately ask some people, would you share this? And other people, do you believe it? Or do you think it's true? There's a big disconnect. And people are much more willing to share particularly things that align with their partisanship, but we also find it for COVID. People are more willing to share false content than they are to say that it's true. And what our data suggests is the reason for that isn't that people are post-truth and don't care about veracity anymore and are happy to share anything, regardless of whether it's true. It's that social media platforms, sort of by design, are focusing people's attention on all kinds of social factors that are not accuracy. You're conditioned to think about, what's the response if I share this? How many likes am I going to get? Like, what are people going to say? What's it going to say about me? And not, is it true? And so the sort of attentional spotlight is shifted away from accuracy. But if people were to actually pay attention to accuracy, they would be reasonably good at telling what's true or false, and they would not want to share the false stuff. So we've done a bunch of experiments, both using survey experiments and actual, like, a large-scale field experiment on Twitter, that shows that if you just shift people's attention back to the concept of accuracy, you don't have to do a normative thing where you say, you really shouldn't be sharing inaccurate content. It's not like chastising people. It's just bringing the concept of accuracy to top of mind. That makes people significantly more discerning in what they subsequently share. And the way that we've primarily done that is by showing people random headlines, not things that they shared themselves, just being like, here's some random headline, how accurate do you think it is? And just by asking that question, it makes salient, oh yeah, accuracy, right, that's a thing that I care about and that I should be thinking about. And then you see when they go back to their newsfeed, they're more discerning in what they share. So we think that the platforms, because their goal is to maximize engagement, they're doing all this work to focus people's attention on engagement generating things. But they could use the same tools that they have for directing attention to that to instead direct attention towards accuracy. And I think that that would get people to essentially clean up their own behavior. It's scalable. It doesn't have any infringement on, rights or First Amendment or anything. It's totally just like helping people do the thing that actually they would really want to do if they were paying attention anyways. And then the other thing that we've been talking about, which does have some more sort of First Amendment implications, is, and so if I was saying is just asking people to rate the accuracy of headlines, even if you threw away their responses, it would still be useful because it would focus their attention on accuracy. But we also have been asking, would using those responses be helpful? And we now have run a bunch of studies that suggest that you can, it seems quite promising to use crowdsourcing to help make fact-checking scalable. So we find that if you show people random headlines and say, just read the headline and lead, how accurate do you think it is? And then you average the responses of 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans, so we keep it politically balanced, with as few as sort of 10 lay people ratings per headline, you get as much agreement between the lay people and fact checkers as you get amongst fact checkers themselves reading the whole article and going and doing the fact checking. And so I think that to the extent that the problem with fact checking is that it doesn't scale, I think it actually seems much more promising than one might expect to help the fact checking scale by harnessing the wisdom of crowds. And the idea is, even though any individual person is not, an expert and is not probably great at judging the veracity of things, through the wisdom of crowds, if you aggregate responses, various biases and things like that cancel out, and you actually wind up with remarkably good performance. And this has been shown across a ton of different domains. We've shown that it also works in the context of evaluating the veracity of articles. So those are sort of 2 things that I think that platforms could do to really improve the quality of what's getting shared.
Thank you so much. So I want to thank all of you, the 3 of you, for your presentation and for your fascinating and enlightening pieces. It was really interesting for me to read you. So whether we talk about algorithm or fact-checking, what goes out of your pieces is that it is not in the best interest of social media to fight misinformation, because their business model relies on keeping the consumers on the platform as long as possible, and curating the public debate is far from being their first preoccupation. And it's often contrary to their economic goal. So in order to, what goes out of the 3 pieces is that in order to fight disinformation, we need to get people to slow down and consult less but more valuable news. And this is also a bit contrary to the goal of the platform of keeping people on the platform. My question to the three of you is thus, which public policy do you think of to force platforms to tackle this issue seriously? So I think publicizing the result of your research is a very good first step, but I'd like to know if you have other ideas to do that. And do you think of a policy of education to the media outside of the platforms would be useful and performant in order to curate the public debate? And the third question comes from Valerie's article and presentation. I think the point you make about like the role of journalism is very important. And my question is, how do we enhance the journalist's role in the age of social media? So I don't know who wants to answer first to the questions.
These are really hard questions to answer. It's like,
I'm sorry, yeah, but
no, don't worry about it. But you know, I'm not sure I can answer the question about policy, but I think that maybe a question that Jonas and I have been talking about also is that, and it may be related to some of your questions too, and I hope that helps answering them. But the idea that there's like a constant interaction between journalists and these platforms, and journalists of course have to go on these platforms, even though they're, as I said before, losing some of their gatekeeping power. But by going on these platforms, they're really trying to harness it. And one example of this is how in our interviews, journalists were talking about how they actually are not really following the trending topics anymore, and it's actually the decision-making process about deciding what's true or what is worthy of verifying or fact-checking, which are completely different, is constantly in the back of their mind, and there's not really one process that answers this question, but the awareness of or a lack of transparency of platform and the awareness of trending topic not necessarily being representative is big, and especially among fact checker too. A lot of fact checkers have mentioned how they wouldn't necessarily try to correct information that is only on one platform. So if the information has traveled across different platforms, then they'll be able to check it. So I think just kind of talking about two different kind of approaches and the realization from journalism and fact checkers that it's important to see what are the limits of the platforms. But to answer your second question about what can be done, and I feel like Jonas and David would probably agree with this, but of course, everybody should go to journalism school, and they should be classes about that, and they should be earlier on for freshmen, they should be classes that are helping people to sort information online. And I think, and it's starting also in preschool, but it's also not really present either at the moment. So I think it's kind of a push towards doing that would probably help.
Can I respond to that? I think that, like, you know, everyone going to journalism school is it's sort of makes sense as like given that it seems like a lot of the problems are you know, what looks like people failing to evaluate content in a sort of correct way. But our work suggests that a lot of the problem is less about people fundamentally not knowing what to do or how to evaluate claims, and more about just not bothering to do it because they're distracted on the platform. So I feel like you know, obviously part of what you get from a good education is like realizing it's important to think about these things. But my take is that it's less about needing to improve basic literacy skills or basic news knowledge, and more about trying to get people into the mindset while they're on the platform of, I should be thinking about this stuff. And so I think, even people who have like a high degree of media literacy and who in the context of their jobs, for example, would like really think carefully about whether things are true or false, when they get onto social media, they're still likely to make mistakes because you're scrolling quickly through the feed. You've got news mixed in with babies and cats and whatever other crazy stuff. And a lot of the reason you get onto social media in the first place is you want to relax and unwind and not be in your sort of work critical thinking mode. And so, yeah, I feel like I would invest more in either pressuring or somehow, I think it's hard to figure out how to do this from a policy perspective because it's sort of hard to quantify, but like policies that push the platforms to try to focus people's attention on accuracy, I think can get you a big return without needing to send everybody back to journalism school.
Thank you very much for your answer. They were a very good answer, even though the questions were difficult. Jonas, do you want to add something?
Yeah, it's, I'm like obviously kind of like different angle, and I promise I don't want to send everyone to journalism school. I kind of like was thinking, obviously kind of like with my provocation, kind of like, the question is, what are we going to do about recommendation algorithms? Be that on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, etc. And I think, like one thing that we've seen in journalism, what happened over the years because of, severe mishaps was basically introducing no harm doctrines, right? Ethical frameworks in which journalists are supposed to work. And I'm wondering whether we shouldn't, like make social media companies kind of like implement similar frameworks that, puts ethics first and considerations for kind of like, as I said, the public good, right? And I think that is highly relevant and important, right? I don't want kind of like politics to go in there and say, hey, you shut down all recommendation algorithms in the realm of politics, right? Because obviously this can have trickle effects that might be very negative in the long run. But I think that social media companies, if it were up to me, should shut them down regardless, but not without government pressure, but rather because social media companies realize that no matter what they do, they can't win. There's a beautiful German word called verschlimmbessern, which means that in the mindset, their intention is to improve things, but the only thing you're going to do is you're going to make it worse. And that is kind of like my sense of what social media companies are doing. And especially in the context of politics, I would argue that social media companies need ethical guidelines and boards that basically hold them to that.
Can I make one follow-up point related to that, which is, I think a super important part of all of this is that whatever policies the social media platforms are adopting, I think it's critical that they do assessments of the impact of those policies and that they reveal that they're transparent about those evaluations. Because they run a million experiments all the time. Anytime there's a new feature, they always have a holdout set, but we don't ever hear about it, except in like little drips and drabs from PR releases that are not really telling you anything that's useful. And so I feel like, like even with this example of what happens if you get rid of the recommendation system, that's like an empirical question. There's all kinds of possibilities for like unexpected consequences, but like there's a way to find out, which is do it for some people and see what happens, and then tell everyone about it.
Right, and I mean, we know that they're doing those things anyway, right? Like they're doing all these A/B studies consistently, we just don't know about it.
Exactly. And the problem with the don't know about it is A, they don't tell us about it, but B, even if they would tell us about it, people would not really believe it because you don't know about all the things that they didn't tell you and so on. And so I feel like some kind of partnership with not just like a policy advisory board, but some kind of like scientific advisory board or something that's like external experts that sort of can say, this is what you need to tell people, that can sort of weigh in on what information is released, I think could give that a lot more credibility and sort of usefulness for the public understanding what's going on.